Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm sure you've heard of Murphy's Law. Murphy's Law has picked today my electronic Bible. It says it's still loading, so I'll have to use what we call the Google search PDF version in hard copy, which is the ordinary Bible, or the printed Bible, as we say. So the other one will have to be temporarily retired until I figure that one out. Welcome to those who may be on the web. Today we're going to take a look at, we've been working our way through the book of James. We're going to work our way through that for the verses. It's a fairly short chapter. There's 17 verses. But they're very pithy verses. You know, I've got a lot of meat to these things. And then I'm going to hand out a little handout on how to and ask ourselves these questions on how we're going to apply what we've learned in the book of James. And so we'll get into that in a minute. If we take a look in the book of James in chapter 3, starting in verse 1, "My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment." This is somewhat awkward. I'm in a position where I'm a teacher twice at church and as a bivocational situation, as well as at school. And leadership imposes a responsibility. You've got a responsibility if you presuppose that you're going to teach something. But who's James really writing to here? He says, "My brethren," meaning all Christians. And they're really looking at, don't really necessarily want to rush to be a teacher, because when you do, and if you do, then a stricter judgment. There's a higher scrutiny. And of course, if you're standing in front of anybody or next to anybody, they're going to walk away and saying, "Did you hear what he said? I cannot believe," or "Did you hear how he said it? Unbelievable." And then you go away and you got your opinion of that person. And we can all bring that focus and that scrutiny onto ourselves. But that's really what we're called to do. In this life, we have a number of positions that God has called people to do, but that's really what God's calling is about, as in the as we would say in the world tomorrow in God's kingdom, where we're going to be teaching a lot of people, whether it be by word or by example. So really that responsibility devolves upon each one of us. That judgment is going to come to each of us. When we read the last half of that verse, "Let not many of you become teachers," or part of that verse, the King James reads, "not many masters." Well, the Greek word here, Strong's 1320, it simply means those who have mastered a topic on a knowledge. Now, if you want to become an expert in a subject, the way to do it is you read a book on that subject every week for 2 years. And if you've read 100 books on a subject, you will have, and it's been demonstrated over and over, you will be considered a worldwide expert on that subject for a simple reason. Nobody else is doing it. And so, if you want to be an expert on that subject, you can be. And are we all going to be experts on the same thing? No. We're going to lean on each other's expertise in different areas. The James, we don't, of course we weren't there, so we look to presume, why is he writing this? And if you take a look, James may have been addressing some problems that may have been occurring in the church at the time. If you take a look at the Jews, the Jewish parents at that time, well, they wanted their child to become a rabbi, of course, so you press them into that vocation. And this may be a conflict then, if all of a sudden they're offered Christianity and yet they've been pushed and pushed and pushed to become rabbi or teacher. And then there's this human characteristic. People seem to covet a position that they see as prominent. Now, this can be particularly awkward when somebody strives because they want it, not because they have the capacity to teach, but because they want the prominence. And so that can be a stumbling block along the way as well. And so So there are a number of things that James was addressing there. But what it winds up was that sometimes people wind up teaching things they don't know anything about. And as we heard in the sermon today, that sometimes the sermonette was flat and the sermon stank. In fact, I think he used the term bread worms, just like in the manna. And there are times you're going, wait a minute, that subject, I think it's just not exactly the way I understood that subject. And so we want to be mindful of that or careful of that and tolerant when it does happen. Then, of course, what can also happen is that when you have those that aren't that aren't the master of the subject, they might not endure sound doctrine. In other words, they might be just crowd pleasers with false doctrines. You have to be careful of that. And so one has to be careful of preachers that are, and we see them on television, they're preaching things that people, what they want to hear, and they want to feel good, but it doesn't necessarily comport with the Bible. So then let's follow through on verse 1, knowing that we will receive a stricter judgment. This is very uncomfortable to anybody who's a teacher. Now, being a high school teacher, I have parent-teacher conferences. And some of these parents I've never seen before. And this last year was the first time I've ever had a parent come in and really give me the what for. I went, whoa, we've never met, we've never really talked, because little darling daughter or son got an 87 instead of a 90, and they've never gotten a B before. And of course, the only reason for that is because the teacher, of course, gulp. So you find yourself in the target. You're subject to stricter judgment. And of course, it's easy. It's my fault. It's always my fault. And so we move on, and little Johnny or little Susie does fine after that. But the stricter judgment will come, and it's automatic. And it's true as well in a church environment. If we take a look at Matthew 7 and verses 2 through 5, in Matthew 7 verses 2 through 5, for whatever judgment you judge, you shall be judged, and with whatever measure you measure out, it shall be measured to you again. And why do you look on the splinter that is in your brother's eye, but do not consider the beam that's in your own? Or how will you say to your brother, let me pull the splinter out of your eye, and behold a beam that is in your own eye? Hypocrite! First cast the beam out of your own eye, and then you shall see clearly to cast the splinter out of your brother's eye. So it's being very, very careful when we're going to, if we are going to be applying the stricter judgment to someone, and I believe there's an old saying, be careful about condemning someone until you've walked in their shoes. In other words, see where they're at, knowing where they're going, and so forth. So it's a caution. And in Mark 12:38 through 40, in Mark 12:38 to 40, and he said to them in his teaching, this is Christ, beware of the scribes who love to walk about in robes, and love greetings in the markets, and the chief seats in the synagogues, and the uppermost places at feasts, who devour widows' houses, and as a pretense make long prayers. These shall receive greater condemnation. So there is a stricter condemnation, and particularly those who are doing it for self-serving purposes, rather than to do it for teaching purposes. Of course, we know Ephesians 4, verses 11 through 5, that he himself gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers. For what purpose? And we read that purpose. For the equipping of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ. Until when? Until we all come into the unity of the faith and knowledge of the Son of God. Are we all yet in the unity of the faith? Well, look around. Just turn your TV on. Well, we aren't quite all in the unity of the faith. Do we all have the knowledge of the Son of God? No, we're still learning. We're still growing. And then it continues on in the verse, to a perfect man, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, that we should no longer be children, tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, in the cunning craftiness of deceitful plotting, but speaking the truth in love may grow in all things into him who's the head, Christ. So there are various positions throughout the church that we fill, and one of those are teachers. But you know, the biggest thing that we teach is how we live. And that's really the teaching example. So that's our lifestyle, is the teach. And so as we go through James, we're going to take a look here, not just at the words, but we can then also take a look at the actions that people do, because that's the lifestyle that we put forward. The instructors or the teachers get a stricter judgment because we presume that they must be completely aware of what they're teaching others. We can't just stumble in and say, we're teaching this even though we're unaware or ignorant of it. We have to be careful of what we teach. And it's, if we look in James 3 and we go to verse 2, for we all stumble in many things. Sound familiar? Does to me. Because everybody stumbles somewhere. We aren't perfect in speech, we aren't perfect in action, and we aren't perfect in thought. So when we look at James, use the word we. He didn't say, you stumble in many things. He said we. And who was James? He was an apostle. So we all stumble in many things. If we go back to James 2:10, if a man fails to keep one point of the law, he's charged with failing to keep the whole law. And it's only through the law of liberty that we can then be counted righteous, back in James 2, verses 10 through 14. So let's continue on in James 3, verse 2. If anyone does not stumble in word, he's a perfect man, also able to bridle the whole body. Well, let's step through this, because this is a pretty deep chapter, and it's often referred to. And in fact, probably many sermons come out of several portions, but we're going over just covering an overview of it. If anyone does not stumble in word, well, the word is how teachers mainly communicate. That's the tool that's used. And all men sin, and the sin or the stumbling of the tongue is the easiest to fall prey to. Sort of reminds me of people that make New Year's resolutions, and there was one lady says, you know, this year I'm going to resolve to stop putting my foot in my mouth. And she turns to her friends and says, I suppose your resolution is you're going to finally figure out how to do your hair. Well, that first resolution didn't last very long. And so we have these, we mean well, but it just doesn't always turn out the way we had intended. So stumbling, if anyone does not stumble in the word, he's a perfect person. And another way to translate the word stumble is to put in the word offend. Now, I know you all don't know how to offend people, but I can give you lessons. Unfortunately, I don't mean to. But it just seems to happen from time to time. And when we say something, like the lady telling her friend about her New Year's resolution, well, it must be, becomes out as an offense. Okay? To stumble is just like somebody tripping and falling. That's, and it can happen that quickly. You're talking to a person here on April 5th of 2015, managed to sprain both ankles at the same time. And I've yet to find anybody else who's managed to do that. Now, that was a stumble. Okay? And so this word stumble has special meaning to me here. It means really to trip or to fall suddenly, as if your support was taken away. Ever felt as though your support was taken away? Just jerk something out from under you and the stumbling. Well, a man's word can take away his integrity. If you stumble, if you say the wrong thing at the wrong time, I know I've kicked myself by saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. Oh, that was a poor choice of words. Why did I say it then? Or why did I say that? Or why did I say it now? I could have just as well done without that. Or as my father famously advised me, you missed a perfectly good opportunity to keep your mouth shut. And let's continue on in verse 2. Also able to bridle the whole body. Well, this term bridle is somewhat interesting. And I'll get into this in a few minutes because he's going to give an example. James is going to give an example here in the next verse about a horse. So I'll reserve that for the moment. But continuing, he is a perfect man in James 3 in verse 2. The word perfect is also the same word that's used as Strong's 5049, teleos, and meaning is the same as when Jesus taught in Matthew 5:48. Therefore you shall be perfect just as your Father in heaven is perfect. He also used the term when he was speaking to the rich young ruler in Matthew 19:21. So the Bible tells us that God is perfect. He didn't say anything out of place, or by accident. He spoke good words that were creative and helpful. So we really should strive to make our words follow Christ's example. So then to be perfect is to reach the ideal, to be the ideal Christian, which I mean, that's the ideal, that's the aim, right? To be the ideal Christian, to be without sin. So until then, we're all imperfect beings. And we all fall short of the glory of God, and we need a Savior. When it says now here, perfect man, the word man is actually, really refers to husband. And so when we see the word man, if we take and read it into a perfect husband, and it's distinguished from being a woman. So you take a look at some of the research here, and I just never thought of it before. But this word is never used with regard to females. It's distinct from women, and yet both men and women are baptized. We know that in Acts 8 verse 12, and we go through some of the examples as to why were they referring here to husbands when you have to be a perfect husband in this case. And so it's not saying that women don't need to control the tongue, but the husband is expected then to set the tone and the standard for the household as to how he chooses to speak to others. And then the relationship with his wife then can be measured by how they speak to each other. And so the success then of a family, the success of the father, the child relationship hinges on how he speaks to them. So peace then reigns in the house when the husband and father control their tongue. So it's talking about this leadership position on how to control the tongue as being a path toward becoming perfect. Now we get into verse 3, and in fact verse 3, 4, and 5. I want to read all three verses, and I want to compare them. Indeed, James 3, verse 3, indeed we put bits in horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Verse 4, look also at ships. Although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. Verse 5, even so the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. Now, James uses these graphic word pictures, and they put an image in our mind of the power of the tongue. And so if we compare it, we have three different things that are represented here. We have things that are controlled. A horse, a whole horse, a ship, a whole ship, and then we have a forest. So we have a horse, a ship, and a forest. And what is the object that guides or directs the horse? It's the bit or the bridle that goes in the horse's mouth. What guides or directs the ship? Well, that's the rudder at the stern of the ship. And what about a forest? What directs the destiny of the forest? All it takes is a little spark, one spark. So then, if you take a horse and you put a little bit of pressure on the bit in the mouth. Now, when I was 10 years old, I was fortunate enough to get a horse, a young horse. And so by the time I was 14, I was able to ride the horse. But nobody else had a horse. I mean, it was the only horse on the farm. And I'm riding my delightful horse, but she wasn't familiar or acquainted with other horses. And I took her, it was about a quarter to a half mile away from the home farm, and I'm out on the alfalfa field. It's summer, it's August, the corn is tall at the edge of the cornfield, and I was having a great time. And I got to the road where the alfalfa field ended. There's a big cornfield next to it, and that was a shock because right around the corner were two neighbor kids that had two horses, and they were riding in the road ditch. My horse looked at them and got scared and bolted for home. There was nothing I could do to redirect that horse. I'm 14. I'm scared to death. I'm hanging on. The horse is running faster than I've ever seen this horse run before. And she's running lickety-split for home. And she's going to go to a safe place. And I hollered. I pulled to the right. I pulled to the left. But she had the bit clamped in her mouth, because that way she wouldn't be controlled one way or the other. She had finagled it. The fear of the horse for seeing the other horses, got scared, grabbed the bit in her mouth, bit down on it. Nothing I could say or do. I just hung on for dear life. And as we approached the farm place, and she had her pen, her fenced pen, where she was normally kept in a little horse barn, but the gate wasn't open. And she was taking a shortcut directly toward it, and there was a fence there. But before the fence was what we call a weeping elm tree, like a weeping willow tree, weeping elm, with large boughs hanging out. And this large limb was just a little higher than her. She would be able to clear the limb just fine on her way to the horse pen. And I did a little bit of mathematical calculation with the physics formulas that were floating in my head at that moment. And I decided that if I stayed on the horse, I was going to die. And as I've never done this before, I've never been a stunt rider in a rodeo. I've watched maybe something. We didn't even have TV at the time, but I knew these things had to occur. And so I would say about 15 to 20 feet before reaching that tree, I left the saddle and took to the dirt. And she went right under there, just fit right under that limb, and leaped the fence. Never knew the horse to leap before. Leaped the fence and went into her pen, and she was just fine and safe. Now, had she been a trained horse, or had been a seriously trained rider, I may have been able to direct her with the bit and proper training. But I was young. I just didn't know how to do it. Didn't know how to handle the bit and the bridle to control the horse. The horse ran away with it. Ever happened in our lives where something we said or did just kind of got away with us? And had we properly or been able to properly guide or direct the horse, would have directed the outcome, would have had a better outcome. I certainly wouldn't have been as bruised up. I was fortunate there was grass when I took the dive. So the implication then, as it's being compared to a tongue here, is that just by a few words, then that it can have a direct impact on someone else. Just a small bit of movement can redirect the destiny of the horse. The horse in this case wasn't being redirected because I didn't know how to redirect. Then we take a look at the example. We can take a look at Psalm 32 verse 9. We're still looking at the horse. In Psalm 32 verse 9, don't be like a horse or like a mule, which have no understanding, which must be harnessed with a bit and a bridle, else they will not come near to you. There's been times when I had a real problem trying to get the halter or the bridle on a horse. They knew what was coming, and so they just avoid all that. And it was a real problem to try to pen them up. So horses can figure out. So don't be like one of those that's unable to be guided. The second example is of a ship that's used in James 3:4, and a ship. Let's take a look in Proverbs 30 in verses 18 and 19. Now, when I was courting my wife a couple decades ago, Mr. Barron came up to me and he said, well, and he says, well, Proverbs 30, 18 and 19. And I wonder, what in the world is he telling me that for? Well, let's read Proverbs 30, 18 and 19. There are three things which are too wonderful for me, yes, four that I do not understand: the way of an eagle in the air, the way of a serpent on a rock, the way of a ship in the midst of the sea, and the way of a man with a maid. Well, I remember that day, and I haven't forgotten, Mr. Barron. I guess I had skipped over that part. In other words, it's a wondrous and mysterious thing when you're in courtship that nobody can really explain it. It just happens. But a ship is likened here to something which is amazing to be seen on the sea. How does it get to go in a place that you direct it to? When I teach history and we look at world geography and how history was developed by the development of a ship, and how those ships are able to cross oceans when the winds are blowing in the opposite direction, is really remarkable. And as the technology of the sailors developed, they were able to go far places. Something I learned just here in the last couple of months, that Christopher Columbus, the Genoese sea captain who had sailed sailed from the Spanish to the West Indies, had previously sailed to England and Iceland. He was an accomplished sailor, sailed all over that side of the Atlantic. And so he well knew how to control a ship. So if you take a look, what little tiny thing directs the ship? Of course, it gets the power from the wind or from the oars, but the rudder is that little guiding object that's being compared to the tongue. Just a little thing. If you compare the overall ship, the rudder is really a very small, very, very small thing. And by turning, by turning the wheel on the ship, the pilot then controls the direction of the rudder, and the whole ship the direction can be changed. And nowadays, I suppose you could use any kind. You could say an airplane. I know that there are great big jets, and you ever wonder when they're coming into the terminal and they come up to the terminal building and they're able to stop precisely at the right spot and all of that? It doesn't always work that way. And I've heard the stories from my uncle, the pilot, said sometimes one wing of one plane clips another one or clips a terminal building, and then you result in $1 million or $2 million worth of damage, and the pilot's looking for a new job on the ground. But this rudder, just a little thing, how it turns, and the example here used as a ship is turn. So take a look at a ship and how tiny the rudder is, and then you take a look at the human body and how small the tongue is, which is really remarkable in that it's just a little muscle. It's just not very, very much, and yet it can change our destiny in that way. And then the third example was a forest. In Psalm 83, verse 14, in Psalm 83:14, we read, "As the fire burns the woods, and as the flame sets the mountains on fire." It only takes a small spark. It just takes a little bit. What is it, 451 degrees to burn paper? Paper is made out of wood. And it just takes a little bit and fanned with the flames, and it can bring out an incredible amount of damage to a huge forest. I spent many years living in Oregon, and the chief industry there for a long time was the forest products industry, for lumber and for paper and pulp and for making plywood and such. And so forest fires are very, very important. They wanted to prevent them, and they had forest rangers and towers watching these things, and now they have or they have cameras up watching the forests and scanning them to see if there's a forest fire, but it doesn't take much. Lightning strikes account for most forest fires that can strike in an area and just leave something sizzle for a while or something, and then eventually the wind can come up and build a huge fire. Southern California has these huge problems where it takes a cigarette and somebody flips it out the window and just this little cigarette smolders for a while, and pretty soon you've got thousands of acres burned, maybe hundreds of homes, maybe people died. Some years ago, I was traveling on I-40 coming back from the other side of Oklahoma. I think it was one of my uncle's 50th wedding anniversary, and we were coming back on I-40, coming across the state of Oklahoma and into prairie fires, huge prairie fires that were burning. I'd never seen one burning on both sides and in between the median on the highway. Just come over the rise and whoa, we're right there. Now, what do? Do you back up on the freeway? Well, how did this sort of thing start? And then we heard, well, there was a fellow who had a trailer, and the trailer that he was pulling had safety chains on it. One of the safety chains had come loose and was dangling on the ground, and that was creating sparks, and the sparks were flying, little chips of the metal, and it was flinging off into the ditch, and these little sparks then caused this huge fire, and which was really an astounding sight when you see walls of flames in that. But it just takes a little spark. And likewise, the tongue is like that, the spark that is being referred to in James, and that can start something. So when we read James then, the tongue is little, James 3:5, but holds much power. Oh my, so the tongue has the power to direct and control. In Proverbs 31:26, she, meaning she opens her mouth with wisdom, and on her tongue is the law of kindness. So wisdom and kindness are going together. If your tongue speaks kindness, that's the use of wisdom. The second characteristic of this tongue is it has the power to destroy, to corrupt, and tear down. Not just to direct and control, that was number one, but number two, the power to destroy, corrupt, and tear down. In Proverbs 18:21, death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit. In other words, some people do want to destroy, they do want to corrupt, they do want to tear down, and they have the power to do it by saying the right turn of the right word. And the third characteristic here that a tongue can be used for has the power to praise and edify God and build up others as well as oneself. So you can use the tongue for very positive purposes. In Proverbs 10:11, the mouth of the righteous is a well of life, but violence covers the mouth of the wicked. So this use of the tongue can be encouraging for people. And haven't you been around people, whenever you see them, they're just always upbeat. And I'm thinking, well, I'd really like to be like that. I have students like that. Every day they come in, it's like they have happy pills. Every day they're just happy, just naturally that way. I've got a granddaughter, and she's not even 2 yet, and I'm thinking, there's something wrong with this child. She's always happy. I mean, she's never fussed. She's just pleasant and cheerful. And my daughter finally took a picture of a time when she was grumpy just to prove it actually happened. But some people just seem to have that kind of a characteristic and are able to do that naturally, and some of us have to work on that part, but to build others up and speak well of oneself as well, because we're made in God's image, and so praising and building up others and ourselves helps us to praise and edify God. We look in Ephesians 4:29. Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers. So we want people to be encouraged and not discouraged by what we say. I know as a school teacher, if I say something discouraging, I'm going to hear about it. I'm going to hear about it several different ways. Student probably won't say anything, but she'll go home to mommy and daddy, or he'll go home to mommy and daddy. They'll tell other teachers, they'll tell other students, and then pretty soon it'll get around to the principal, maybe the school board, maybe to other teachers and so forth. I know this because I hear about some other people having this comment. I think, hey, wait a minute. If they're saying it about one person, I got to be careful. They might be doing this about me. So I should be very careful here that whatever I say builds them up and doesn't tear them down. And that's like that way as well, church-wise. In James 3, continuing on in verse 6, and the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity, a world of sin. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature, and set on fire, and they use the word here, hell. Of course, that's what all the translators knew at the time that they did this. So James is drawing a parallel between using the tongue and causing a huge fire. The reference here is when we're talking about a world of iniquity. The word for world is cosmos. It's Strong's 2865. It simply means an orderly arrangement. In other words, it's not physically necessarily the world we're talking about, but an orderly arrangement, the way life is going on around us. So what we say can affect the world around us very, very quickly. As the world is sort of an orderly system. Reading on in verse 6 in James 3:6, the tongue defiles. Well, that's uncomfortable. Well, how does a tongue defile the whole body? Well, as it affects what we do, what we think, how other people treat us, that this tongue can create a fire then. And you've ever heard of the term or the expression, don't play with fire or what? You might get burned. Okay, and that's really what happens is when people say the things that they shouldn't say, then the tongue defiles. That can come back on someone. When it's so much easier to say something that's encouraging or something that's positive rather than to respond negatively, is to find a comforting way to say something. In Psalm 140, verse 3, they've sharpened their tongues like a serpent. Adder's poison is under their lips. Ooh, I used to have a boss like that once. I'm sure we've all had those experiences. And then we look at Proverbs 15, verses 1 and 2. A soft answer turns away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. The tongue of the wise uses knowledge rightly, but the mouth of fools pours out foolishness. We kind of got to be careful with Proverbs 15, 1 and 2. If we look at the next chapter over in Proverbs 16, 21, an ungodly man plots evil, and his lips are like a burning fire. But now we have this burning fire, and then we read 10 chapters later, Proverbs 26, verses 20 and 21. Where there is no wood, the fire goes out, and where there is no talebearer, the fighting ceases. As coals to burning coals and wood to fire, so is a quarrelsome man to fighting. Wow. So the direct comparison here is, don't put fuel on the fire. Have you heard the term? Yeah, don't put any gas on the fire. You're just going to make it hotter in this case. And if you don't add to it, eventually it's going to go away. It's going to burn out on its own. And it's interesting, it puts down their talebearer in Proverbs 26:20. When there's no talebearer, if there's not somebody in there stirring something up, let it go. Just let it go. And there's a lot of times, probably the best thing we could do is to just just let it go, and don't miss an opportunity to let it go. There's no reason to keep it burning. I'm concerned here about our time, so I've done 3 through 6. So what I'd like to do is pass out a number of questions that we might want to take. And while I'm moving on here, you want to be developing some participation for yourself, because I want you to be able to say, or how would you approach some of these subjects. In James 3, verse 7, for every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. Well, God gave the ability to subdue the earth and have dominion over the creatures of the earth. We read in Genesis 1:28. And then, and after the flood, Noah, God spoke to Noah, and he gave him the same command and said, the fear of you and dread of you shall be on all the animals of the earth and every bird of the air. So all the wild animals, they see us, they run away. Well, except for the hungry wolves, but even then they may be scared of people, and if they haven't seen them before. So it says all of these things, people can tame and subdue the world, but then look in James 3, verse 8. But no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison. Wow. So it's really, really hard. It says nobody can really, really tame the tongue. Years ago, I went to seminars before buying a house. I wanted to learn how to do that. I had to make sure my credit was in really good shape. So I flew to LA, and I went to some seminars on how to make sure everything was just right so I would be in the best possible position. And the attorney giving the seminar said, never talk on the telephone about anything having to do with credit and collections and all of that. He said, always put it in writing. And somebody said, well, why not? And he said, you cannot control what you say. Now, this is a very secular person. He said, you can control what you write and you can edit, but you can't control what you say on the telephone. He said, you will blurt out the wrong thing at the wrong time. It will be misconstrued. So you're better off just keeping your mouth shut. Ooh, good point. So I lodged that away. Is when you're making a deal or preparing yourself for that big operation, or that, in my case, it was figuring out how to buy a house. I wanted to pay attention to every little detail in there, and that's so. While we have yet a few minutes here, and I'm going to cut it right here at James 3, and we'll pick it up in James 3, verse 9 the next time. But I do want to take a look at some of the questions here. How is our speech influenced by others around us? Do you think of yourself as being mostly influenced by the speech of others? Or do you are the one that influences how others speak? Then the other question you might consider is, how do you react when you hear someone cursing or using abusive language? I'm sure we've all heard it somewhere at some point, sometime before. Or what practical advice, number 3, would you give to someone who wanted to control his tongue better? Number 4, what positive words do your friends and acquaintances need to hear from you this week? Number 5, without telling specific personal stories, that fits into the category of gossip, give some generic examples of how words can be as destructive as a forest fire or a wild animal. Number 6, in what ways can we use our tongue to refresh others, like a fresh stream or a fruit tree? And see if we can come up with some examples. And I'm going to perhaps set aside number 7 because we haven't gotten that far yet in the Bible study. So what I'd like you to do is to take just a few minutes. And several of you, in groups of 3 or 4, get together and come up with an answer. And see if you can come up with, answer whichever one you want. And I'll wait a few minutes and then see which one you want to answer. So just pick and 3 or 4 people get together and and come up with some, what is your experience, and pick whichever one you want. And it doesn't matter if everybody picks the same question, because everybody's not going to have the same answer. So give yourself a few minutes to go ahead and discuss that and see what your contribution would be.